So now we are witnessing the transition of the Virginia colony in the 1600s from that of a servant society, or we could also call it a society with slaves, towards that of a slave society. And one ideology and practice that emerges during this transition is this notion of racialized slavery. And to define it very plainly, it's up there on the slide. It's the belief that the condition of slavery is naturally connected to skin color. And in Virginia, obviously, this means black skin. So persons of African descent in the colony, once you transition towards that of a slave society, it's going to be thought that those persons of black skin are also naturally slaves. In fact, there is no distinction between the two. It is not an arbitrary fact that persons of African descent happen to become slaves. No, it is natural for them to be slaves. Okay, so again, it's seen as natural. Today we might use the word biological again, right? Now, let's recall that, this is the way race was conceived as Europe began to expand outward and gain colonies in parts of the world that happened to be occupied by persons of darker skin. They began to categorize them by skin color, calling themselves white and calling other people brown or yellow or red or black. Okay, and again, let's also recall that the way race was conceived back then has nothing to do with today, the way we think about it as ethnicity or culture, right? Uh, Back then, it was thought that not only was there a distinction based on skin color, but it even went beneath the skin, if you will, that these were biological distinctions between people. Okay, so that is the meaning of race back then during the age of European imperialism. And it's certainly seen here as race gets connected to slavery, to the point where, let's say, you are a resident of Jamestown, Virginia in, let's say, 1700. If you happen to see someone across the street, for example, who was black, you thought there's a slave, right? There's no distinction between black and slave. Now, this is something that is specific to, in this case, colonial America. All right. Of course, there's been slave systems, slave formations throughout human history, practically since the beginning of human civilizations. But this idea of slaves being connected to a particular skin color was not the case for the most part. Think, for example, of the Roman Empire that went conquering, all of Europe, going down to North Africa, and even beyond that. Um, they would take slaves as well, but they were mostly captives of war, and there was no such thing as really, profit, obviously, that was, or that slave labor was used to enhance, right? So there's obviously no modern capitalist system undergirding the old empires in their pursuit of conquest of the world. And moreover, the slaves they captured could be of multiple skin colors. Okay, so think about other civilizations like Ming China. I mean, they had a slave system there, and they enslaved other Chinese, right? Or persons of similar skin color. So there was no concrete notion that a particular race were naturally slaves, and therefore you shouldn't even contest or dispute that connection. All right, so that's what we mean by natural. All right, so that's what makes slavery in the New World, and in this case, Virginia, somewhat novel and unique, right? It's that persons, in this case, of African descent are seen naturally as slaves. So that's when slavery becomes racialized. Now, the obverse, if we turn this upside down, that is, then it makes sense in this logic that white skin is somehow connected to freedom because slaves or let's say those of dark skin, are unfree because they're slaves, that means white skin, or those that have white skin, are somehow connected to freedom. And let's also recall our discussion of Bacon's rebellion, whereby this new political belief system or ideology was introduced to the New World. This idea of the universal rights of Englishmen. So that was an innovation in political thought, whereby feudalism and its way of compartmentalizing people according to social rank was actually eviscerated, being replaced by this idea that if you're English, you're born with rights, right? Okay, so this, if anything, becomes, or I will say this, that the universal rights of Englishmen only goes or only works to reinforce the idea that white skin is connected to freedom and liberty. Okay, and that's also seen as natural, if you will. Okay, so in the previous slide, I discussed how slave society is a rigid, inflexible society, and that this social hierarchy based on skin color is what defines it. Okay, now if you will, if you can imagine just thinking about the United States of America in the South on the eve of the Civil War, for example, about let's say 1861. If you were in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, you believed in this idea of racialized slavery, most of them. Now, there's a few who are abolitionists, okay, who did not believe in this natural connection between black skin and slavery. Okay, so nonetheless, we see, in other words, how racialized slavery begins with, in this case, Virginia, and this is obviously the topic of our discussion, and it's going to perpetuate itself, and in fact, if you will, gain momentum, gain impetus in the preceding decades and centuries, even. Okay. All right. So racialized slavery is a process, and to be more specific, it's actually in this case in Virginia really comes down to a legal process. And this is what we're going to discuss again. That is to say, you're going to see various slave laws that arise during cases of litigation. And these slave laws will start to compound and add up to the point where, they'll all be collected together to comprise a slave code. And again, once you have a slave code, it's definitely a slave society. All right. So racialized slavery is involved in this legal process. Here is a case where the law will create reality rather than the law reflecting reality, right? And again, this reminds you of this idea of social construction, how the belief in racialized slavery, right? The idea that particular skin color is somehow naturally connected to slavery. Um, that's something that people create, right? But then once it's created and part of your belief system, in fact, it's not even a belief if you're born in that world. It's taken for granted that as an actual fact, an actual reality of your world that you don't even question, right? Okay, so what we're going to examine again is Virginia, or the Virginia colony during the 1600s, and how this became a society governed by this ideology of racialized slavery. Now, before I move on, I want to make three features, or point out three features that we associate with Southern slavery during the colonies, and then moving into the American period, that's to say post 1776. Okay. Slavery eventually will become, and this is what we're going to discuss today, it will become perpetual. That is to say, a person of African descent by law is going to be enslaved from cradle to grave, from birth to death. Okay, it's perpetual. Can you be freed? Well, it's very, very rare, and the process of being freed is called manumission. But manumission was very rare back then. You can imagine why, because slaves were, expensive if you were buying a slave, and they're, the offspring of slaves are therefore expensive, right? They could easily sell it to another slave master and get a lot of money. So it's an investment, and you don't really want to ruin your investment. So, this idea of manumission was rare during the period of perpetual slavery. Now, think back to when Virginia, before Bacon's Rebellion, was a society with slaves. There is no law saying that slavery is perpetual. So remember the case of Anthony Johnson. He actually gained his freedom, arbitrarily by his master, and he went on to even own land and to prosper and own other slaves. Okay, another feature besides it being perpetual is that it will become hereditary. Okay, that is to say, it's going to be inherited from birth. Okay, that's obviously different from perpetual slavery. This means that any offspring of African descent is going to become a slave automatically. Their social status is determined upon birth. It's not unlike, say, feudalism, where once you're a peasant, you're born a peasant, you'll die a peasant. Same thing here. And it's obviously not like today's society in the modern world, where if you're born in, let's say, the lower class, that doesn't mean you're going to die in the lower class. You could, actually achieve mobility and become, let's say, middle class, or even the 1% if you're really lucky. Okay, so it is a rigid hierarchy again when it comes to slavery. So I think I said three features. I really mean two, okay, because really what this adds up to, that is to say, perpetual slavery and hereditary slavery, is the outcome. What this adds up to is racialized slavery in practice, okay, where if it is the case that all persons of African descent, of black skin, is a slave either through birth, and not only that, cannot be released from slavery because of perpetual slavery, that means every person you see of black skin is a slave. And therefore, again, it becomes calcified, ossified as this natural connection between skin color and slave. Okay, so racialized slavery, again, it has its beginnings with certain laws that make slavery perpetual and make it hereditary. So what I want to do now is actually explore the reasons why African slavery actually became widespread in the New World. When you think about it, it's a completely arbitrary and haphazard episode in world history. How did Africans end up in the New World and become slaves? And not only in North America, but certainly in the Caribbean, in Brazil, parts of Latin America, right? Still today, if you go to, say, Cuba, go to Brazil, you'll see the descendants of Africans, right? The original African slaves there, right? Why was it the Africans that came over and became slaves? Why not, say, the Slavic people or Russians or Scottish or what have you, right? You could almost pick randomly which quote unquote race. All right, so why Africans? Well, the beginnings of this actually were forged by the Portuguese explorers. And I mentioned them earlier. Here's a map, and the Portuguese are obviously located very close to Africa. And therefore, in their exploratory efforts to reach Asia, they decided to explore the western coast of Africa. So they're coming down this way, and eventually they're going to go around the Cape of Good Hope and reach India. around the same time that Columbus reaches the New World, actually. So they have a different destination, different strategy to get rich by going to Asia. Columbus, of course, will go this way, right? So right away, once they're exploring the coast of Africa, the Portuguese get this idea um, to set up plantations here among the islands that are located in the western coast, in the more northern parts of the African continent. Islands like the Canary Islands, Madeira. Okay, some of these were actually unoccupied. But what they did is set up these plantations. Now, let's recall that the plantations are used for profit. Okay, this is not subsistence agriculture where, again, you're involved in diversified farming to feed yourself and feed others. No, you're growing crops to sell on the market. Again, that reminds us of the fact that this is modern economics at work. Okay, growing agriculture for profit, right? Okay, so they're experimenting here, and they will utilize African slaves. In fact, in this depiction right here, this is actually a plantation in the Caribbean. Okay, and it shows an English plantation utilizing African labor as African slaves as labor, and basically the English got the idea from the Portuguese. Okay, they emulated their system, their plantation system. In fact, if you look at this depiction, you see the master's house on top of the hill, right? This is not only it's actually kind of symbolic, right? And also due to surveillance reasons, right? They're up on a hill, and they can surveil their slaves working. And also, if you look at this depiction, that could easily remind you of Southern slavery in the United States of America, let's say in 1830 or so. All right, so should be obvious, therefore, what's happening here. The Portuguese are the ones innovating, if you will, on the plantation system. And then the English imitated them, and they brought it to the Caribbean. Now, in the Caribbean, and I should mention this, even before slaves arrived in Jamestown in large numbers, there was already about 1 million slaves in the Caribbean from Africa. Okay, so that tells us that what the English are going to do in the North American colonies, like Virginia and the Carolinas, they're going to copy the English in the Caribbean. All right, so this is where the idea of the plantation system utilizing African slaves pretty much comes from. It's borrowed from the Portuguese, and it's transmitted through the English in the Caribbean to North America. Okay, so we'll move on to the next video.